Across the water from Port Arthur, the dead were buried in full view of the prison. More than 1,000 bodies lay on the Isle of the Dead, convicts, soldiers, women and children. And behind them stood a settlement built not just to punish the body, but to break the mind. The prison is gone. The sentence has ended. But some say Port Arthur never truly emptied. Port Arthur stood at the edge of the world, surrounded by cold water and dense forest, a place chosen for isolation where distance, landscape and design worked together to prevent escape. Men were sent there after failing elsewhere, already punished and now facing a system designed to remove contact, restrict movement and enforce silence over long periods of confinement. From the moment of arrival, the message was clear. Port Arthur was not intended to correct behaviour alone, but to control it completely through structure, routine and constant supervision. Established in 1830, the settlement expanded into a controlled environment of workshops, barracks and yards. Each section built to support labour while reinforcing discipline across every part of daily life. Convicts cut timber, constructed buildings and maintained the site under watch, their time structured by strict routine where work, rest and movement followed a pattern that rarely changed. The system depended on consistency, ensuring that every day followed the last, limiting variation and reducing opportunities for independence within the controlled environment of the settlement. The location itself reinforced control. Cold waters surrounded the headland, while dense forest and difficult terrain stretched beyond, creating natural barriers that made escape unlikely even without direct supervision. Those who arrived understood quickly that leaving would require more than determination. The environment added pressure, turning distance and terrain into part of the confinement. The isolation shaped how Port Arthur functioned, containing not only the people within it, but also the experiences that developed over time inside its boundaries. In 1848, the separation prison introduced a different approach, shifting focus from physical punishment to psychological control through silence, isolation, and carefully managed routines within a purpose-built structure. Prisoners were kept apart wherever possible, their movements directed and interactions limited, reducing communication until even brief contact became rare within the controlled environment of the building. The design aimed to influence behaviour by removing external influence, leaving individuals alone with their thoughts for extended periods within confined and regulated spaces. Inside the separate prison, daily life followed a strict pattern, where silence was maintained and time passed with little variation, marked only by routine movement and changes in light. Cells were narrow and enclosed, limiting space and restricting comfort, while high windows allowed only minimal light, reinforcing the sense of separation from the outside world. Accounts from the period describe strain developing gradually under these conditions, as extended isolation and controlled routines affected behaviour and altered how individuals responded to their surroundings. Within the separate prison, silence was enforced at all times, with prisoners moving under supervision, prevented from speaking, and separated from one another even during routine movement through corridors and shared spaces. Communication was removed deliberately, reducing interaction until even basic conversation became unfamiliar, leaving individuals without the reassurance of contact that would normally exist within confined environments. This approach altered behaviour gradually, as extended silence and isolation affected awareness, making small sounds, movements, and changes within the building more noticeable over time. Even in shared areas such as the chapel, prisoners were confined to individual stalls, positioned to prevent visibility of others, ensuring that presence did not lead to recognition or interaction. The arrangement created a controlled environment where individuals remained physically close yet entirely separated, reinforcing the removal of identity within the structure of the system. This level of separation extended beyond confinement, influencing how individuals perceived space, sound, and movement within the building over extended periods of time. Reports from the period describe individuals struggling under prolonged isolation, with some showing signs of agitation, restlessness, and difficulty maintaining focus within the confined environment of the prison. Rather than remaining still, some prisoners were recorded pacing their cells or reacting to small sounds, suggesting an increased sensitivity to their surroundings as isolation continued. These behavioural changes were noted over time, indicating that the conditions did not remain static, but altered how individuals responded to confinement and routine. Beyond the prison itself, Port Arthur functions as a complete environment, where work areas, accommodation, and medical facilities operated within the same control system that governed behaviour and movement. Daily life followed structured patterns across the settlement, with little separation between labour, confinement, and routine, reinforcing consistency throughout every part of the site. This meant that the atmosphere created by the system extended across the entire landscape, not limiting to a single building or section of the settlement. Just offshore, the Isle of the Dead served as the burial ground for those connected to the settlement, positioned close enough to remain visible from the main shoreline. More than 1,000 individuals were buried there over time, including convicts, staff, and families who lived within the environment of Port Arthur. The location created a clear division between the living and the dead, while maintaining proximity that ensured the cemetery remained part of the wider landscape. Burials on the Isle of the Dead followed the same structure as the settlement, with marked graves generally reserved for staff and military, while most convicts were buried in unmarked ground. This division continued beyond life, reflecting the hierarchy that governed the settlement, where status determined recognition even after death within the confined environment of Port Arthur. The arrangement created a cemetery where some identities were preserved, while others disappeared, leaving large areas without markers or names to indicate those buried there. From the main settlement, the island remained clearly visible across the water, positioned in a way that made it difficult to ignore during daily movement along the shoreline. Boats travelling between the two locations would have reinforced this connection, linking the routines of the living directly with the process of burial taking place nearby. This regular movement between settlement and cemetery created a practical connection, rather than a distant or abstract separation between the two spaces. Across the water at Point Pure, younger prisoners were held within a separate reformatory, introducing another layer to the system that extended the reach of the settlement beyond adult confinement. The presence of this site demonstrated that the structure of control applied across age groups, reinforcing the wider function of Port Arthur as a complete penal environment. Together, these locations formed a connected system where movement, behaviour, and outcome were shaped by the same principles throughout the area. Illness, injury, and conditions of confinement contributed to a steady number of deaths over time, adding to the population of the burial ground just offshore. Those buried included convicts, staff, and families, reflecting the broader community that existed within the settlement during its years of operation. The accumulation of burials linked the island directly to the daily life of Port Arthur, reinforcing its place within the overall structure of the site. When the settlement closed in 1877, the structured routines that had defined Port Arthur came to an end, leaving the buildings and landscape without their original function. Over time, the site shifted from active use to abandonment, with structures left to deteriorate or be repurposed, while the layout itself remained largely unchanged. This transition altered how the environment was experienced, as movement, sound, and activity were replaced by stillness across the same spaces. After the site closed, reports began to appear from those returning to the ruins, describing unusual experiences that could not be easily explained by the condition or layout of the buildings. Visitors walking through empty areas describe hearing footsteps that seemed to follow at a distance, stopping when they stopped and resuming when the movement continued through the space. These accounts appeared across different periods, often from individuals unfamiliar with previous reports, yet describing similar patterns of sound and movement within the same areas. Within the separate prison, visitors have described a noticeable shift in atmosphere when entering certain corridors, where sound becomes muted and movement feels slower without any clear physical cause. Some report sudden drops in temperature within enclosed spaces, despite stable conditions elsewhere, creating a contrast that is difficult to explain through natural environmental changes alone. These experiences are often brief, but leaving a lasting impression, particularly when they occur in areas associated with isolation and confinement during the prison's operation. Staff working on site outside of public hours have also reported unexplained events, including sounds of movement within secured areas and doors found open after being checked and locked. In some cases, individuals describe hearing voices or indistinct speech in otherwise empty buildings, without any identifiable source or explanation for the sound. These reports are documented across different roles and time periods, contributing to a consistent pattern rather than isolated or singular experiences. The Isle of the Dead carries its own set of reports, with visitors often describing a stronger sense of stillness compared to the main settlement, despite similar environmental conditions. Some describe a feeling of being watched while moving among the graves, particularly in areas where markers are absent and the ground remains unbroken by visible identification. These accounts do not rely on visual sightings, but instead focus on perception and atmosphere, which many find more difficult to dismiss once experienced directly. Across the entire site, the experiences described tend to follow similar patterns, regardless of when they occur or who reports them, suggesting a consistency that extends beyond individual interpretation. Footsteps, changes in atmosphere, sounds without visible source, and a sense of presence are among the most commonly reported features across multiple locations within Port Arthur. The repetition of these elements has shaped how the site is understood, linking present-day experiences with the conditions that once defined life within the settlement. Visitors moving through the ruins often describe a sudden pause in their own movement, where something feels different, even though the environment appears unchanged and no visible cause can be identified. Some report stopping mid-step or turning unexpectedly, convinced someone has entered the space behind them, only to find the area completely empty when they look. These reactions occur without warning and are described in similar ways by individuals who have no connection to each other or prior knowledge of earlier reports. Some accounts include individuals leaving specific areas of the site earlier than planned, choosing not to return after experiencing sudden unease that they were unable to explain. In these cases, the reaction is immediate rather than gradual, with individuals describing a clear decision to leave the area despite no visible cause for concern. These responses differ from general unease, suggesting a stronger reaction that occurs without warning and without any identifiable trigger within the environment. The design of the separate prison continues to influence how the space is experienced, with narrow corridors, enclosed cells, and limited light shaping movement and perception even in its current condition. Visitors often describe a heightened awareness within these spaces, where small sounds, changes in temperature, or shifts in light become more noticeable than in open areas. This sensitivity can make otherwise minor changes feel significant, particularly in an environment already associated with prolonged isolation and controlled behaviour. Movement across the site remains largely unrestricted today, allowing visitors to walk the same paths once used during the operation of the settlement. This continuity means that individuals experience the same physical layout, moving through spaces that have not been significantly altered in structure or position. As a result, the environment itself remains the constant element, regardless of the time period in which it was being experienced. Port Arthur was built to control movement, restrict contact, and enforce silence within a confined and isolated environment designed to shape behaviour over extended periods of time. The structures remain, and the layout continues to reflect the system that once operated across the site, preserving the conditions under which those experiences originally developed. The prison closed, the routines ended, and the people were gone. But the experiences reported there have never fully disappeared, remaining tied to the place where they first began.